I want to, first of all, express my appreciation to Tom and Ernie and our working together to bring this course into being, and I hope I can measure up to what's already been presented. I've really been challenged by this effort to try to cover this much history and be halfway understandable. I don't see how Tom's done it, so I apologize wherever I might have glossed over some ideas, and hope you will ask me about them. In these next three lectures, we'll enter a different aspect of our view of the relationship between science and religion, and delve further into the function of religion and of the sacred over the centuries and millennia so that we can gain some better perspective on what it is that we are called to be about in the days ahead. Today we'll look at the images of God that have been used by humans over the centuries. Next week we'll explore the need for God and what functions the sacred serves in the lives of the past and our life today. The following session we'll look at how we begin to reframe our religious symbols, practices, and myths to be more meaningful as we seek to engage the sacred for our life. First of all, it may be important for us to be self-aware about our interest in this subject. To what degree are we hoping to find some greater assurance that God is truly with us? Maybe even to have science prove the existence of God, which will never happen in my view. Why do we need that assurance? Maybe it's that questioning itself is proof enough of the existence of a sacred, or we'd never ask the question. I don't know. You can think about it. As we enter these next three lectures, it seems also important to be clear about the difference between the existence of the sacred and any religion about the sacred. Now, I'm using the term sacred to not use the term God, because God means certain things to us. So I'm talking about that which is beyond God in this case. The sacred and a particular religion about the sacred are not synonymous and never can be. Religions are our expressions of, our response to, and the practices surrounding our relationship of the sacred. Religions will change over time, the sacred will not, or at least that's my belief. There are those, of course, in process theology camp who propose that God changes as God experiences life through us. I really can't see that as necessary, but maybe that view is helpful to some people. For our purposes here, just know that I'm working on the view that the existence of the sacred is eternal and unchanging, but our conception of that existence is always changing and needs to change. And that's one of the basic reasons for this course, because we are raising the issue of how must our understanding of the universe now affect how we will talk about and relate to that unchanging source of life. So, to the subject of today, which is to look at how the sacred was imaged over the various stages of history from the beginning until now. I've really found a lot of difficulty in separating this session from the next one, but because there are forces at play in the development of the concept of the sacred that must wait until next time. So I hope I've succeeded in what needs to be done today. We're going to take a brief review of what's been said so far about humans have developed in social structure from earliest times, so we can have some structure for looking at the ways the sacred is portrayed over the millennia. 50,000 to 10,000 BC, basically hunter-gatherer groups. 10,000 to 3,000, increasingly larger settled groups, the development of agriculture with leadership growing from tribal chieftains to kings of city-states. 3,000 to 1,000, large city-states with armies who conquered large portions of the world. We're talking about Sumer, Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, Rome, China, India. 1,000 to today. The decline of empires and the development of nation-states and other major developments, of course. We'll get back to that. And now with that same timeline, I want to go back and look at a little different timeline maybe, but look at the kinds of, just a brief look at the kinds of understanding the images of God that were found, and then I'm going to come back and deal with it in detail. You're going to get some, hopefully the repetition will be helpful to you. 5,000 to 10,000, animism, world explained by spirits who motivated all of creation. 10,000 to 3,000, a pantheon of spirits, gods developed, and the development of a hierarchy of spirits and gods. Shamanism developed into a priesthood and also the king becoming a god in lots of cases. 3,000 to 1,000, a full polytheism, kings and priests with ritual power over the people. A more organized pantheon of gods with gods over other gods in case, or fighting each other. Gods becoming national gods. In 1,000 to 500, and to today, rather, henotheism, or monolatry. I ran across that's a new word for me, monolatry. It really means a god, having a god who was greater than the other gods, being really focused on one god, even though you still had other gods, believed in other gods. And in this period, the birth of monotheism in the Middle East, especially in Palestine, with some close examples in other places. 500 to today, the further development of monotheism in the West, still some polytheism in various regions, along with many different forms of religion. Atheism, agnosticism, which probably already always existed, but which not in the same way that we talk about it today. Now, I want to go back in more detail now and look at each one of these areas. One thing seems fairly consistent from what I've read and what you've heard previously, that the form of a religion and therefore the image of the deity was closely tied to the social structure of the time. The shape of the religion was intertwined with the cultural development, so that the religion, even the God that's on top, changes with a change in the culture of a particular people. Please note that I've assigned the content that I put in each one of these periods is based on my overall reading and may not actually produce what happened at that time, because it's all really very complicated and a lot of it's speculative anyway. So, in the hunter-gatherer period, it was one in which people swam in an ocean of spirit. If you ask one of them what their religion was, they could not answer because life was their religion. They dealt with the spirits, the gods, all the time on an ongoing basis, and the spirits were not much different than their fellow humans. They had human characteristics and were often seen as the source of bad things that happened just like humans were. The spirits were an animation of the natural world, which helped explain how the world worked. The relationship with the spirits or gods was one of negotiation to get what one needed to survive. You were careful to respect the deer spirit, for instance, so that there would continue to be deer to eat. You did things to be sure that you had children and simply that bad things would not happen. The relationship with the spirits became ritualized so that you could be more sure that what you did would bring about what you needed. In reality, of course, the rituals were illusions, but they accomplished their purpose, which we will delve into more fully in the next session. Why the spirits were conceived is not that clear. I think it's a fascinating question. Maybe one source were the dreams which a person would see a parent or fellow family member who had died. So they surmised there was another world of the spirit. Right? And certainly that was the case of the development of a ancestral worship. More simply, maybe it was just the way they could explain the world in which they lived. I'm one to suggest that they conceived of the spirit because there was something about how they experienced life that led them to consider the possibility of something more. And of course, their relationship with other people had a great deal to do with the nourishing of any such sensitivity. There is an understanding that some writers have put out that there was or came to be a kind of basic underlying belief in another realm of the spirit. And a person's participation in that realm was seen as beneficial. So you had this concern to have the ritual and participation in that realm of the spirit. This was a period when polytheism, the belief in many gods, was in full swing. A little different from animism, since the gods were not so much in the natural world, or like the tree was a spirit, but now had control of the natural elements. As humans became more populous, they began to live in tribal situations and leadership positions developed from those in the clan who had special talent to hunt, etc. Chiefs began to lead the clan or tribe, and the leader also then in performing the rituals. A further development was the rise of shamanism, in which a person who seemed to have special ability to relate to the spirit world began to form rituals on behalf of the people. This was a major step toward, you guessed it, a priesthood. The image of the gods did not change, but the relationship of the people to them evolved into something very different. The person moved further from having direct contact with the spirit when they could perform the rituals themselves. Agriculture had come into existence, and people began to live in larger and larger units until we come to the time of the great city-states, such as the one in Sumerian civilization of Mesopotamia. Writing also began to be used so that the codification of religion and the practices became possible. And it's why we have documents from that period around 3000 BC, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'm not sure you may be acquainted with the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a story of a flood story. And in it are a couple of lines that are almost identical to the lines in our story of the flood in the Old Testament. So you can say there's a lot of relationship between those two stories as it was passed down over the centuries. Might be interesting to see, this is the genealogy of the Sumero-Akkadian gods. I know you can't read that, but at least you can see the large number of gods they had and the intricate relationships between them. And of course, the sacred also took on a new face. Now the sacred was seen as a god of the nation. There were still other gods, but many times there was one or more gods who were more powerful than the others, who had some kind of overall concern for what was happening. In some cases, we saw a god who was very concerned about the state of the people and desired to care for them. Here you had such names as Anki, Iana, and Enlil in Sumer. Enlil was a sky god and son of An and Ki, who together formed the universe. Enlil was the most powerful of the gods. In Egypt, we find Osiris and Anubis and Horus in this picture in that order. These were not exact images for the real god. For the real god they saw was a mystery, so the images of each god could change over time. The next period, 3000 to 1000. The period from before 3000 BCE and on considered the age of the beginnings of civilization. But it was still dominated by polytheism, in which the gods were the powerful guardians of the city-states and the empires that developed. There certainly was an established priesthood to provide the rituals, but also the king was often seen as the head of ritual performance, and even a god him or herself. It was upon him or her and their expertise in performing the rituals that the fate of the people depended. It might even happen that when bad things happened, it was the king who lost his head as a sacrifice to the gods. Which god was on top in a country or empire might just depend upon whether or not it was advantageous for the political, economic conditions in the particular government. If it was deemed helpful to trade with another country, then it might be that the leaders would simply join the gods in an alliance. Or it might be that one would take over the other. And that was certainly the case in the conquest of one country over the other. It seems that people just used whatever god was on hand to fit their needs. And of course, who was on top was decided by the country's rulers and their control of the ritual. Here you have a king sacrificing and making an animal sacrifice to one of the gods. I think the god was Shamash, I believe, in Sumer. As the ancient science became more rational, the nature of the gods became more universal. Here is the god of thunder in China. The stories of the gods might have a creation myth in which the gods battled each other to create the world. In Babylon, Marduk slaughtered Tiamat, the primal ocean, to create heaven and earth. And the battle was reenacted each year to assure the world's continuance. In Syria, Baal fought Lotan, the sea dragon, and Yam, the primordial sea. And we see these stories reflected in our own Old Testament when Yahweh fights the sea dragon Leviathan. Then there were the sex orgies, of course, to celebrate Baal's reunion with Anat, his sister's spouse, and that surely had something to do with fertility. Tribes warring with each other is reflecting the name of the gods. In the earliest appearance of Yahweh in Israel, Yahweh was Lord Sabaoth. You've heard that in songs, but you know what that means? That means Lord of the armies. At first, the religion of Israel was actually polytheistic, as the people who came to be Israel were a part of the Canaanite culture in the 2nd millennium BCE. That's why we have in the Bible names for God that have El in them, El, Elohim, and even Israel. El was a Canaanite deity in that early period who was replaced by Baal. That's one of the reasons for the continued battle between the people's belief in Baal and in Yahweh. It was a time of movements in the culture as the people called Israel exerted their separation from their cousins, the Canaanites. There was a slow movement from that polytheism to a monolatry at that time. Monolatry being the belief in many gods, but with one God being more powerful and maybe even controlling the rest. Yahweh came to be held to be more important or more powerful than Baal, for instance. You had parallels to monolatry in Aten with the god Aten in Egypt, Marduk in Babylon, and Zoroastrianism in Persia, and Lord Krishna in Vedic India. Monolatry was the first step in the direction of monotheism. In China, the religion began as the usual animism and shamanic expressions, and then developed toward a focus on ancestral deities where the gods were virtuous people of the past. In India, we would find the beginnings of Hinduism, a polytheism that developed a way of relating to an underlying reality through various expressions such as Krishna or Vishnu. It's important to mention here the momentous development in the understanding of the nature of the sacred called the Axial Age. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend Karen Armstrong's book, The Great Transformation. The period of the Axial Age was roughly from 1600 to 200 BCE, and is called that from the rise of a greater sense of compassion, ethical sensitivity, and inward spirituality in the religions in more than one place on the earth. As examples of this, you have Taoism in China, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, ethical monotheism in Israel, and philosophical rationalism in Greece. The teachings of the spiritual proponents of this movement began in a reaction against the unprecedented violence of their age. And although there were differences in their teachings, there was an amazing consensus in their call for the abandonment of selfishness and the taking up of a spirituality of compassion. Now, it's important to remember that there are some scholars who see an underlying genetic thread in humanity toward empathy, toward a concern for the other and all people. An example of this might be the Code of Hammurabi, which was a precursor to our own 10 Commandments, which counsel many of the same attitudes toward other people that show up in our scriptures. But the Axial Age went further to explore a more inner, critical look at ourselves and a corresponding sense of compassion for all people. Of course, the expression of this compassionate spirituality was not consistent over time and was quashed and sometimes reasserted in the centuries following its birth. We might say that we can see the thread begun in that ancient time as having moved through our cultures and brings us today the major but often hidden movements toward a more compassionate world culture. We can be thankful that we do not have thousands who are still sacrificed to a sun god, or thousands who are enslaved to build some king's burial palace. But we do still have thousands who are killed in unnecessary wars, and thousands who suffer sex slavery and other forms of terrible injustice. And to which gods are they being sacrificed? And we'll discuss the reasons for our continued bit to evil next week. A lot is going to happen next week, so come back. Was this great transformation in history caused by the sacred? Or was it simply the outbreaking of a genetic tendency toward concern for others? The rise of the prophetic movement in Israel and certainly the birth of Buddhism in India are examples of the later flowering of the Axial Age that was taking place in this period. The Old Testament prophets call for concern for justice for everyone and compassion for the lowly. Siddhartha Gautama, called the Buddha, taught the inward letting go of the self and the embracing of a path of compassion for all life. This is the period when monotheism comes to full flower in the people of Israel. The major move to monotheism seems to have happened during the period of the exile, when that great trauma was seen as a punishment of Yahweh for the sins of the people. But that same Yahweh had compassion and returned them to Judea to rebuild. If Yahweh could do that, then he must be the greatest of gods and the only God. Of course, really the one to thank for all that was actually Cyrus, the Persian emperor. But remember how we understand the deity is deeply shaped by the cultural events in the life of the people. In addition to that event, there seemed to be some economic and political factors which entered into this, which caused Israel, the king of Israel, in this case Josiah, to move toward a monotheism away from a simple monolatry. This development brought an ethical monotheism with a God who asked for certain behaviors from God's people that we participate in today. In the same period, Karen Armstrong notes that after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the spirit of the Axial Age flowered again in Pharisaic Judaism, in Jesus, and in Paul. And also it flowered again later on in the birth of Islam. But still we find a retrenchment over and over again, and this time in the demands of empire, as the latest Roman emperor, for instance, took up Christianity in order to assert unity, aided the development of an orthodoxy that came to demand certain beliefs if one was to find salvation. Take a moment to, I tried to follow some of the other countries, other areas of the world, and in this case I want to look at Greece, the Greek gods, which you all are probably acquainted with. This is Zeus on the left, and Dionysus. Zeus was the head guy, of course. Dionysus, the god of wine and parties and debauchery and all kinds of things like that. Ares, the god of war, and Aphrodite, the god of beauty. So that was something about the pantheon of the Greek gods. 500 till today. In the West, God is now the God of Christianity, the creator of the earth, who is also expressed in Jesus, who is the one who saves us from sin and gives us eternal life. And I've always wondered whether that's a return to polytheism or not. It's certainly a misunderstanding of the Greek philosophy which gave birth to the doctrine of the Trinity. Christianity and eventually Islam replaced the many gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon, and certainly of the kingdoms of the Middle East. The religions of China and India continue to develop in their own directions: Confucianism, Taoism, ancestor worship in China, and Hinduism and Buddhism in India and other parts of the Far East. And certainly Hinduism is, still might see it as polytheism, but it's certainly morphed from something different from the old polytheisms of the previous age. The Christian church in the West became very powerful and still involved in the political order, We just can't seem to break that tendency, can we? The world of the common folks was still, in some ways, in the early period of medieval times, certainly, in which the spiritual forces that moved in various ways in their life, often in spite of the church. One can point to several places, for instance, where the church, in order to battle these older beliefs, refocused pagan earth myths with a Christian myth. The most familiar, and I'm sure you're aware of this, being the celebration of Christmas, which came at the time of the ancient winter solstice celebration. We baptized the winter solstice and made it Christmas. In the church, the myths of the scriptures were accepted as expressions of spiritual truth and without question. I would say that the Roman Mass was a real force in the life of the peasant and a continued means of control by the church. Ritual was still used as control. In this period also, the monastic movement was born out of the desperation of certain faithful people to escape the violence and oppression of the societies of Europe and the Middle East and find a way to deal with life as it was taking shape in those days. But all that changed beginning in the 14 and 1500s with the movements of the Enlightenment, including the printing press and the scientific affirmations, which of course have been going on all along in various ways, but which certainly came to the forefront in these years. In the church's arena, it was Martin Luther who brought a fresh direction in calling for the primacy of Scripture in opposition to many of the teachings of the church. Luther was simply trying to reform the church, but the forces of nationalism were out to overthrow the power of the church and use the Protestant movement to gain their own ends. And actually the primacy of Scripture became just another means of control with divisiveness within Christianity. So who is God in all of this? Certainly the only God, with no other gods allowed, an ethical deity, but one which demanded a certain obedience in the face of the threat of hell and loss of eternal life, a very threatening visage, which often took on the face of Jesus as well. But it was a God who had created all things, a God who intervened in life and caused things to happen according to His, and God was a He, according to His will. Of course, at the same time, however, there were voices such as Meister Eckhart and Teresa of Avila who preached a compassionate God who is immanent in all of us. That's still there. It hasn't gone away. But the claims of science began to raise questions about the teachings of the church, and the modern age was in full swing. And so we come to another theism on the negative side, the existence of atheism in our culture, which seemed to exist in other cultures in ancient times, but probably not for the same reasons. Atheism, a belief that there's no supernatural entity or existence that is needed to explain life. It may well be that the existence of atheism is really the fault of, in this case, the Christian church, for a failure to do what had been done over history and to change the concept of God to fit the age. And that is what we're about in these presentations. I want to deal with another issue before the summary. Some of you may be aware of this. There were female gods in the pantheons, in case you're wondering, in every instance I came across. And some were pretty powerful, and certainly took their toll on the male gods at times. They were, of course, in charge of motherhood, earth, and fertility, but also ruled over war, death, and destruction, as well as creation, healing, and compassion, and life. As for female god who became a truly monotheistic god, I couldn't find one of those. In Hinduism and Buddhism, there are central female figures in some of the sects. And I know that some of the forms of the earth religion, such as present-day Wicca and the ancient Druid faith, have females at the center of their worship. I think we have to accept that situation as simply the prominence of a patriarchal society. Not that it was right, but that's the way it was. I do believe that there are plenty of female images in our own scriptures, for instance, which ascribes to God some very important female characteristics. And one of the most powerful expressions of the power of God was the female Sophia, the personification of God's wisdom. So, in a little attempt at summary. The image of the sacred began, evidently, as a spiritual presence within various aspects of the natural world. These spirits were present in the animals, but also animated the trees, the mountains, the heavenly bodies. Humans sought to have a relationship with those spirits through rituals that they believed provided them with what they needed to live. And naturally, the spirits took on very human characteristics and were related to more as other people than as gods. The world in which these early humans lived was an ocean of spirit. The spiritual was life. The key mover in the change in the concept of the sacred was the social structure and the culture of humans. A form of polytheism reigned for at least 10,000 years and is still present in some form today. The early animated spirits came to be known as gods who rule various parts of life and fought each other as humans fought to bring the earth into being or solve a particular problem. As the culture moved to great cities and kingdoms, the gods became powerful supporters of the culture, and some gods came to be more powerful than others and therefore more worshipped than others in a monolatry. Various forces, in particular in Palestine, brought about the first true ethical monotheism, although polytheism existed for many centuries in the West until the Christianizing of the Roman Empire, and still exists in India in a certain form. As I've noted, in the opinion of some scholars, there was at least an underlying belief in a spiritual existence beyond the physical, and our participation in that existence was very desirable for life. There seems to be some agreement that the sense of empathy for others is a genetic trait that was there from earliest times in humanity and must therefore have played a part in existence of a sense of concern for the common good and the desire to live together with some amiableness in at least your own clan. Therefore, we might say simply that the sacred is represented over history in various forms that are directly related to the needs of the people at that stage in history. That might mean the assurance of food, protection from evil and even death, and support in times of war, and even help in economic development. The sacred is seen also, however, as a god or gods who are concerned about people and who wants peace and justice. The sacred is ultimately seen as involved as well in the creation of and the condition of the universe, the earth, and life in general. What's most fascinating to me is why humans even considered in the beginning that there was a spirit that was other than themselves, that had something to do with their life. Was it simply a projection of their experience with others onto the natural world? It's also fascinating to consider what factors then entered into the phenomena of the actual age and its heritage that is still with us. Was that the sacred moving within us, or just our genetic disposition, or are the two things the same? It's interesting to compare this movement from animism to monotheism to the cognitive development of the person from infancy to formal operations. From a pre-operational stage where there's a form of animistic perception by the child toward the world, to the ability to think abstractly at about the age 12 years. That would mean that the move from animism to monotheism was simply a maturing of how we see the world, of the brain processing experience in ever more abstract ways as we experience life. But does that mean that the sacred is not still a part of the experience of the world? What does this evolution of the image of God have to do with the continuing evolution of humankind? We have noted some relationship between the evolution of culture and some genetic dispositions. We have noted a relationship between the practice of religion and certain cultural developments as the way in which religion aided cohesion in a community and contributed to its continuance. But is there a connection between the dependence upon the sacred in whatever form and the future evolution of humankind? Of course, an answer to these questions will strongly depend upon whether or not you are disposed to believe in the existence of a sacred anyway, or not believe in one. Again, next time, we will return to those issues. These are all interesting questions, but the main question for us, what must be our image of the sacred for the future, given our present understanding of the universe and of our times? That's the question for us that's directly related to today. today's focus. What effect does or should the evolutionary picture of our universe have on our image of the sacred? Is the sacred the life force that drives evolution? Is the sacred an integral part of life, or is it separate from life, entering in as needed? Does it preside over a sacred scripture that is inerrant, or is it that spirit which engendered the insight to write the mystical stories and wants us to write some new ones? How does the sacred want us to image the sacred in the days ahead? Thank you. Questions?
There seems to be a dichotomy between the Western religions of Europe and the Americas and the more Eastern religions in the idea of a jealous God, the idea that you have to be in my religion, and if you're in that religion, then you're in the wrong religion. And of course that went back to the religious wars, but even today we have sects of the Protestant faith that claim that all other sects are in error and doomed. And then back when I was growing up, there was even a rogue Baptist church in Garland that said that only members of that congregation had the right path. But you go to the East and you see that most Japanese practice both Shintoism and Buddhism, or you see that the Chinese who practice a religion may practice Buddhism and Confucianism or Taoism. And the Hindus took the Buddha back in as a god of Hinduism. Is there any explanation for why there's this split between Eastern and Western religions?
I did not come across one. Of course, you always have the problem of human tendency to separate themselves from somebody else anyway, and that's layered upon the religion. But you do ask an interesting question about the East and the West. Of course, the East always has a tendency to be more community-oriented than the West does. The West tends to be more individually oriented, and the East more concerned for community and community unity, and et cetera, and depending upon the community. So that may enter into part of it. But it's a good question. I don't know a good answer. Anybody else have one answer for that?
Man, do we have any answer to that question? What must be our image?
That's what you have to answer.
I'm sorry?
That's what you have to answer.
Yeah, but...
Well, that's what we want to explore the next two sessions. Next time, as I said, I want to talk about some issues that have to do with why we need a God anyway.
Why we need one?
Yeah, why we need a God anyway. And do we need a God anyway? And explore what the history said about that. And that enters in the issue of how humans function. But
Ben, let me make a comment
Sure.
and maybe raise a question on this. I think it pertains to this question maybe in an oblique kind of way, and that is that we see ourselves as human beings. I am a being. I see you as beings. And we have, for millennia, seen God or gods as beings, supernatural beings, but beings unlike ourselves, but still beings. I say that as background because Paul Tillich's famous comment about God is the ground of our being, the more I think about it, the more it begins to resonate with me as being that God is something internal to us as a ground of who we are as a being, and of others as a ground of being. And that's an image of God that's different than an external image of God, but it's a very powerful kind of an image of looking at God as an internal ground of our being. And maybe that's the direction we're headed. So,
okay.
comment on that.
Okay. Well, I certainly I have my own ideas about it. I don't have any answers for it, because I think the direction has to be in that same direction, that God is I call it the life force, you might say, that is the ground of our existence, and it's what causes a movement of creation to go forward. But there's still that issue of why do we need to understand that? That there's something beyond us to give us that sense. And that's what I want to do with next time. But
Well, Ben, thank you for your research. I know that took a lot of digging around. My challenge is that it's kind of self-centered, humanity-centered, as opposed to God-centered. And so what about the statement that God reveals to us humans whenever and whatever God chooses? And that might be in a variety of ways, thus explaining the different religions of the world, because the revelation that has been brought to them has been different. But who is the mover and the shaker? I think it's the spiritual God.
well, underline, yeah, right, because that's all we can see in the history. The question that's why I said, why do the people choose to decide their spirits in the world? And where did this axial age direction come from? Is there, in a sense, the spirit, the sacred that speaks to us from within, like Tom said, that hooks in us that which we know to be the only way to live, that then we begin to talk about? The problem is that gets covered over by all this other stuff that we deal with in life and our other needs and concerns, which causes us to look at that issue. And I really debate about whether to just ditch this particular one and go on to the next one, because so much is involved in this issue of whether we need God or not. Yeah, that's the issue, and it's the question of what's the nature of that. You see, if God, and we have prevenient grace in the method of understanding that God's always speaking to us from within. And what's God saying to us? I believe that very much. And so God's saying something to us. And are we listening to it?
Or with what?
Are we listening to it?
Yeah.
But we have, and so what religion then does is begin to talk about what God's saying. That doesn't mean religion's right in all cases, but that's where religion comes out. I mean, that's where it comes from. Begin to talk about what God is saying. And so the axial age sages came up and said, this is what the sacred is saying to us. This is what we need to do. But then you have on the other side the people who come along and say, no, we got to keep warring with people. We can't be good to people. We got to keep separating ourselves off and killing other people and that sort of kind of thing to be okay.
This business of God speaking to us, I think we try to term it in words, sentences, thoughts, etc. I think the why do we need God is, you look at a flower or you hear music, and back to the transcendences, which in my opinion is the expression of God. And that's why I think Eastern religions have become so popular in our culture in the last few decades, is because we're moving from, quote, religious structure, the need to be able to pay for our building because now we're going to have a church, etc., which is still important. I'm not saying it isn't, but that there's more in life, in the obvious, of beauty and power and transcendence, and those are the things I think that most speak to me in terms, and I do identify that as God.
Yeah, okay. Sure. Yeah, I don't think when I listen to God, I don't necessarily hear any words. If I hear any words, they're words that have been taught to me about what God needs to say to me, those kind of things. But yeah, it's a much more inward kind of process.
I would like to get a little more information about the question posed on the screen. What must be our image of the sacred? The must sort of suggests some sort of commandment, and I wasn't sure what you may have meant by that.
I sometimes, people have criticized me using that word. I don't necessarily mean it as a command, but there is a sense in which, if we're going to continue to live on this on this earth together, what must be, what needs to be, our understanding of the sacred in these days for the future. That comes out of the understanding of the universe we have today. I mean, we have entered into another kind of great awakening, so to speak, in the religious realm. I think I said this in the introduction. There's a revolution going on. And it has to do with this very issue. And the answer to it is going to take however long it takes to find out what the answer. We're going to develop as a people the answer, but I think the church should have a really important part in doing. All religions should have a really important part in that conversation. If we represent compassion and justice in the world, and a sensitivity to nature, et cetera, et cetera. So. Yeah, I think there's a calling to be very concerned about what that is. Not a command, but we need to be really concerned about it. And I think somebody asked me the question after my introduction several weeks ago about what I saw this revolution where it's going, and I really think it is the movement toward the inward spirit, the inner spirit. That's how we understand the sacred, because what we keep, our language keeps saying God is this being someplace, a being, rather than no thing. As Eckhart says, God is no thing. Not nothing, but no thing. Not a thing,
Ben,
but a, yes.
I want to ask, what do we do to change the old images that we keep using over and over and over in our services and in our Sunday school classes, that don't push us to get to a point where we think of the sacred as being something more?
Yeah. That's a tremendously important question, which I'm struggling with right now, trying to work on Christian nurture for the future in the church. How do we do that? And I don't know, is it going to take our preachers where does it start? It starts with you in the classes beginning to understand the talk that way. It involves us teaching that way. Involves preachers beginning to preach that way. All sorts of things.
I'd like to
Sure.
to follow up on Dati's question, which I think is a really important question. Yeah. But I want to be a proxy for a friend of mine. If he were here, he would say this. I don't really necessarily share this concern, but my friend would say, and this guy is very well versed in theology, and he's got good credentials. He would say, how do you thread or how do you walk the narrow line between going into sort of this the whole meditation, Buddhist, New Age, inner life, spirituality. How do you walk the line between that and going in, and which can lead to narcissism, versus the need to redefine the symbols and modernize at least the Christian faith? I think there's a real issue there. You can always fall into, if you throw away the baby with the bathwater and reinvent all your new symbols, there's probably a danger that you fall off into sort of some kind of narcissistic soup. So that's what my friend would say, and I think he has a good point. It doesn't bother me, but it bothers him, and I think he's right.
I don't think that if someone really, if you pray, even as the Buddhists pray or anything, you don't end up with narcissism. Not if you really go the direction that you're supposed to go with that. I mean, that's needed to go with that. I suppose you could say, yeah, you could, but my experience and my training has all been that that's not what really happens, because if the sacred is real, which I believe it is, it's going to turn you the other direction, not from narcissism, but outward. And if you don't encounter the spirit, the sacred, then yeah, you can go all sorts of ways. But if you encounter the sacred, it's not going to go toward narcissism. And there is importance in how you teach that, certainly, I suppose.
Ben, one of my favorite quotations, and I think it's Thomas Aquinas, said, "If we think we understand God, it's not God we're talking about." And I wonder what great theological thinkers of the past, like Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, for example, would have to say to us if they had our present knowledge of the universe and of science, particularly of what we have now understood in the last 50 to 100 years in terms of the creation of the universe and the evolution of the universe, and what we also now understand about the evolution of our culture and our religions, what they would say to us if they would have anything more to say than we say to ourselves in these kind of discussions.
What do you think?
I would hope they would. They had a lot to say then without a very much knowledge to go on.
Yeah.
And I would have to think that they would have a whole lot to say to us. I'm not sure what they'd say.
Yeah. What came to me when you were asking the question was, folks, we've got to realize that how we understand the sacred is tied to our life and has to be looked at in the light of our living. That's why I want to talk about why we need the sacred. What are we doing? What are we looking for when we want God? And it's only as we answer that question are we going to be able to answer the larger question in some sense, and that's going to have to work itself out, I think, over the centuries or whatever it takes to do that.
Well, I think it's a word of caution again. And it was a point I was going to make earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow of thought. It was going back to what Charles was asking. And if you look at Tom's presentation, there's this interplay between religion and culture. Religion drives culture, culture drives religion. I think it's very hard to pull that all apart. And evolution comes into play if you go far enough back. We know that, at least we think we know, that the religious impact on the rise of communities caused a natural selection of those who had that predisposition. And so there's an evolutionary role in that. But back to my warning, and that is that your culture is influencing what you think about the sacred, I would say.
Yeah.
So,
which means we have to get real about what culture's doing. And what is it? That's why the question is important, is what are we looking for in life as human beings? And therefore, what does that mean for what I'm getting out of culture and what I'm getting out of religion? You see?
But I think you have to be very careful about assigning that as a message from the sacred.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we have to understand that as human beings in terms of what it is we're looking for.
And I think the last thing in the world we want is to try to keep those separate, because we certainly want religion to affect the culture. I mean, we want that to happen. If we are practicing a religion separate from the way we behave in our culture, I don't know what kind of religion that would be. And I think inevitably the culture is going to affect the religion also. So that interplay, I think, should be a very healthy thing. It's not always, certainly, but it should be a healthy thing for us.
Yeah. We create culture. Correct. And so the issue is, what are we going to do? And that's the whole point of, in the sense of religion. And you're right to talk about the tension and the dangers and all these kind of things. That's very important. But next time we're going to come back and talk about that very issue, about the issue of the dynamics of what it is that we're wanting and what's culture trying to accomplish. And what does the sacred have to do with that? What's religion have to do with that? Okay? Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week.